Time. It is 2 p.m. Mountain, 4 p.m. Eastern. We are here with Mike Johnson. Not to be confused with the current Speaker of the House. This Mike Johnson has an even longer tenure in the House and throughout the vast federal government. We're going to get into that. He has a book that we're going to be talking about, and that is Fixing Congress, Restoring Power to the People. Mike, so good to have you here today. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Good to be here, Walter.
Absolutely. So, Mike, you are trying to retire. We were talking before the show came on. You're mostly retired, but give us a sense of where you've been and your career that led up to the writing of this book that we're going to get into, just to kind of set the stage for our listeners.
Sure. Well, I grew up in South Dakota, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota. You got it.
Right there.
They have it a purple state up there, I see. That may be true. But I went to moved to Illinois when I was in my late 20s, and I was actually born in Illinois, in Danville, but I moved to Galesburg, Illinois, and eventually got a job with the newspaper there. I'd always been interested in journalism, and so I interviewed, got a job there as a reporter, and was there about 7 years. And when I left, I was editor-in-chief, one of the younger editors in the state, maybe the youngest. At any rate, while there, I got to know Congressman Bob Michel, who represented that district for a while. We became good friends, along with his chief of staff, Ralph Inovich. And Bob was a personally close friend with President Jerry Ford. They had served together in the House for a long time together. And so Bob and his wife Corinne would often get invited to the White House for dinner with the Fords. And at one point, President Ford said to Bob, I'm going to completely realign my communications and speech writing offices very soon to get ready for the 76 campaign. And Bob said, well, if you're looking for folks, I have someone in mind that may fit the bill. And he recommended me to Ford, because I was in the process of leaving the newspaper at the time. And so through several interviews and trips to Washington, I was brought on the Ford White House staff in the Communications and Messages Division, and was there for a year, had some phenomenal experiences, and learned how ignorant I was and naive. And then after Ford lost, Bob called again and said, I'd like you to come to the Hill and be my press assistant. He had just he was just elected the minority whip in the House on the Republican side, and so I did, and I spent almost 14 years with Bob, first as his press secretary, which he had never had before as a member of Congress, and then the last 6 years as his chief of staff. I went into the private sector following that, did some lobbying and communications consulting, but always kept up my involvement in the institutions of government, particularly the Congressional Institute, which Jerry and I co-founded in 1986. That organization has a dual mission of helping members of Congress try to be better at their jobs, giving them some of the tools that they need to serve their constituency better, and also to inform the public about how Congress really functions and what is needed to give our citizens greater access and far more influence over the legislative process so that they feel like they are part of the system, as you would think would be obvious in a system of governance, but it's really not. People think they are being shut out of the process by large campaign contributions, by the media, and other influences on Congress that just shut them out, that prevent them from gaining access and influence. And then retired in 2018. I've kept up some of the activities involved with Congress and politics, but enjoying retirement.
Wonderful. So you said you started. Yeah. Thank you. You say you started the Congressional Institute in 1987. You said with Jerry. Is that your co-author of the book?
Sorry, it's Jerry Clymer, the co-author of the book. He and I, at the advent of the Reagan administration in the 1980s, when Bob Michel became the leader, Jerry and I grew more and more concerned about civility in Congress, comity, reaching consensus and making decisions, and the severity of partisanship during that period of time. It was just getting rougher and tougher and wasn't leading to anything positive. So we attended a meeting of what was then called the Conservative Opportunity Society. It was a conference they had in Baltimore, because that was the kind of model that we wanted to use to create the Congressional Institute, to bring members together. And when we did, Bob Michel said that he only told us to go ahead and do it, and we had to work with the Republican leadership at the time. But he said, I want to ensure that there's no tax money involved in the operation. I want it to be focused on fellowship, members getting to know each other on a personal basis, so that the decision-making process becomes easier in that kind of climate. And I want to also make sure that the focus of the Institute is on the future, not on tomorrow or next week or month, but 5 years from now. What are we going to be doing, and what is the country going to need in 5 years or a decade from now? There's so much pressure on the day-to-day in Congress, and it remains true today, that members aren't given an opportunity to think long range, to develop visions. And so that was one of the key components of it.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And the Congressional Institute is still active today. I imagine that their job is more important than ever. And are they still holding these kind of bipartisan chats between members or retreats?
There haven't been bipartisan meetings in the last several years, but okay. I think those are going to be revised now as bipartisanship is beginning to regain its favor in politics. The Institute, has produced books and pamphlets, and it now holds retreats for chiefs of staff, for communications directors, for legislative directors, and even for district staff and receptionists. So we are trying to assist them and educate them more as to how Congress ought to run, not necessarily how it's running now. And it's just been very well received for almost 40 years now.
Well, that's incredible. 1987, I'll tell the listeners, was my birth year. So Mike's been at it a little bit longer than I have. So I'm excited to hear some of your wisdom. And maybe we'll get back to the Institute, but I want to touch on your book, Fixing Congress, Restoring Power to the People. So you wrote this with Jerry Clymer, who is the same gentleman that you co-founded the Congressional Institute with. You all published this book in 2024. So you had 40 years or so, almost 40 years to in between when you started the Institute until the time you published this book. So, give the people your pitch. What do we need to do to fix Congress?
Well, our emphasis, of course, has been on the citizens' obligation, responsibility to understand how their institutions of government work, and particularly the Congress, because the Congress is the citizens' first line of defense against tyranny and autocracy. And so it's important that if we can convince citizens to become more involved instead of less involved in politics, then they have to start with Congress, because no dramatic changes in how our government functions is going to take place without the Congress. And I know that's hard to imagine when the presidency gets so much attention, especially now. But that's the way the system has functioned for 250 years. That's the way the founding fathers intended it to be, a real representative government. So we have focused on certainly, the procedural kind of reforms that need to be done with the budget process and everything. We could go into that. But we've been looking at something more fundamental. If you get back to what really makes Congress function well and what makes our society function better and sustains trust in government institutions, it's five basic things. First of all, civility, which there is a poor lack of now. The second of all is civics education, which unfortunately has gone downhill in our public educational system. So there are now, I think, 5 or 6 states that don't even require civics courses to graduate. There are more that have turned it into a social studies program that has very little to do with how the institutions of government actually work. And so, and the study after study after study just emphasizes how little people really know about how their government functions. I think only 17% can name the 3 branches of government. I think it was 5 or 6% can't name one. Don't know how many members are on the Supreme Court. They don't know which body in the Congress is primarily responsible for taxing them. They don't know how the difference between appropriations and authorization. You can't really influence Congress and a member of Congress if you don't have some of these basics at your command. What you're going to get back is a nice form letter saying, thanks, we really value your opinion, and put on the newsletter mailing list, but you're not going to get the answers you want. And so we tried to provide that basic platform of information so that citizens can make their contact with their congressman or congressional staff as an action-forcing method of communication, so that they get something back, and they know, they're smart enough to know when they get something back, it's worth something. It isn't, boilerplate. So civics education, civic engagement, getting involved in your local government, city council, school district, whatever. So you learn the fundamentals of politics, the congressional reforms that I mentioned, and finally, the outside influences on Congress with whom citizens are competing for attention. The media is huge. We do 2 chapters on the media and media literacy. How do you get smart about their involvement in the competition they represent, and money. The other big thing we talk about is campaign financing and the huge amounts of money that are now going into campaigns, with which citizens writing a check can't compete. So those are the 5 basic components that we based the book on.
I like it. I'm a lawyer, and so I think about representation often in the context of me as a professional, right? What is it that I provide to my clients? And I think it comes down to basically 2-way education, right? My client comes in and educates me about the problem that they're having, and I provide them specialized knowledge that they can take action on, or I can take action on their behalf if we get that far. And maybe they take that action and then they come back to me and they educate me again, right? And it's kind of this cycle of education that goes both ways. In my mind, that is something like how the House of Representatives should work, right? That essentially your congressional representative and staff should be trying to actively listen to individual constituents and then educate them about whatever the topic is that they're talking about, right? This is something that, we've heard this concern a lot. We're going to consider taking action. You have ideas about what that legislation should look like, blah, blah, blah. And it does, I mentioned this because, I think what you talk about there is, the importance of understanding, for example, that, appropriation bills originate in the House. That there is some base level knowledge that is kind of prerequisite to starting that conversation in a meaningful way. I think is what I heard you say, right? If you send in a message or you call up your staffer or your congressman staffer, and you sound like you have no idea what you're talking about, they don't have enough time to bring you up to speed, right? And so you as an individual, it behooves you to educate yourself before you go into that meeting. And I couldn't agree more, when I get a client who comes to me that has information organized and they kind of understand, what the role of a lawyer is, and they understand, the sandbox that I am allowed to play in, it's very beneficial to me. It makes my job easier. And it, ultimately makes that 2-way education so much simpler. The question I want to pose to you is, wouldn't uncapping the House, wouldn't increasing the number of representatives drastically so that each representative is serving, say 100,000 or 200,000 constituents instead of 800,000, would that give, in your experience, the staffers a little bit more time to help bring people up to the speed, on kind of some of the basics that we do lack? Or is there some other method that we need to get to bring people up to speed? I guess is how do we educate those who aren't educated?
Well, I don't know. No. Sometimes those questions are hard to answer. When you talk about increasing the size of the House, you go back in history, the original Congress, each member of Congress represented 30,000 constituents. And I think in the next 100 years, that went up to 200,000 constituents were, and it just kept growing. And the problem is that in, I think it was 1929, the legislative reform legislation then set a cap on the members of Congress, how many members of Congress you can have, and that's 435 today. That cap hasn't been raised since then,
Yeah.
but we now have what 30
330 million people in the U.S.
330. Thank you. I was trying to spit that out. And because of that blocked ratio system, each member of Congress now represents 760,000 constituents. Well, actually, the member of Congress doesn't represent them because there is no way that a member of Congress, even with modern technology and means of communication, can really communicate on any kind of a personal basis with that many people. It ends up a mechanical process. I remember the Professor Fenno had written a book some time ago about the critical nature of the relationship between a member of Congress and a constituent. And I think today now only 9% of constituents have actually met their member of Congress. So it's a critical issue. If there is an algorithm, I believe, that was introduced by a Professor Brian Frederick, and I'm trying to entrench myself in my memory, but I can't do very well. But at any rate, it came up with an internationally respected system called the cube root rule. Now, if you ask me to explain that, I can't. But applied to our Congress, based on a representational theorem, the number of members of Congress that we should have now are 694, not 435. And that is a base from which to start. Other countries, Britain, France, Germany, Canada, have better representational ratios than we do, far better. So I think in Britain, actually, each member of parliament represents, or there are 650 members of parliament, given the ratio that is applied under that cube root rule. So we have a critical problem there, and it also the fact that there are so few members of Congress. It might seem counterintuitive, but the fact is that a larger House would mean that more minorities, more women, more young people would be represented in the halls of Congress and more able to get in themselves. And that would change the whole complexity. No offense, but there are far more lawyers in Congress today than any other profession. And so that needs to be balanced out, and more members can do that. It would give members more opportunity to legislate in committees and in subcommittees. And there are obviously some serious drawbacks to increasing the size of the House. First of all, be hard to convince the American people, I think, that it's kind of like the surge philosophy in military operations. Instead of backing out, George Bush, Trump, and others have have surged forward with greater military involvement to put an end to things. But that's the idea we have here. So if we can untangle a lot of the inherent problems, the cost of Congress would be much larger. Creating the administrative and procedural changes that would need to be made to accommodate that number. There are all kinds of issues, but they can be overcome. If you take it gradually, don't jump into the deep end and create a Congress with 1,500 members. You can't manage that. You can't govern that way unless you're smart enough to do so, and we're obviously not at this juncture anyway. So yeah, I think that's an incredibly important reform that we really need to take seriously. Jerry and I, in our book, also mentioned going back to the election of U.S. senators by state legislatures instead of being popularly elected. What has happened is that the Senate has become very much like the House in terms of its campaigns for election and its attention to the press and big campaign contributions instead of the states and those constituencies. There are disadvantages to that too. It didn't work so well when that's the way the Senate was elected for the first 150 years or so of the Congress. But at any rate, those are huge.
Absolutely. And I think what strikes me is a couple things. The first is, reforming the Senate obviously requires a constitutional amendment, and changing the size of the House requires a simple bill. And I think that's one of the reasons we're so drawn to this idea is, I think the average American person understands having a teacher to student ratio of 20 to 1 versus 200 to 1 versus 200,000 to 1, right? It's pretty easy, I think, for the average student or person, even who only has a sixth grade education, to say, I could imagine getting a better education if there were, fewer students in the classroom, essentially. And I think it is also important to note on the other end, you actually, there's been a bunch of social science, and you are unlikely to get a better education if there's 6 students per teacher, because you actually need some of that the disagreement, right? You need some level of difficulty in the classroom, and and I just want to touch on a couple of the drawbacks, I'll say, of expanding the House. And I'm a Republican. I've talked to a lot of Republicans about this. Obviously, potentially paying people that currently are perceived as being incompetent is the number one challenge I get. Right? It's like, why in the heck would we want to send more idiots to do nothing and pay them each $170,000 a year plus all the staffer salaries, et cetera? And when I clerked for Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, and when I was there in 2016, the number of non-DOD bureaucrats that are in the executive branch is something like 3 million, right? And so this, I think that it's hard to adjust our mind for the scale of the issue, but when you talk about 3 million federal employees being housed in the executive branch versus 30 or 40,000 staffers in the legislative branch, that's not 2 to 1. It's not 10 to 1. It's 100 to 1, right? That we're talking about. So if you're doing oversight and investigations or something like that, say on a committee, the job of a congressional staffer to try to oversee the work of the executive branch, it is just gargantuan. I mean, it truly is. And my belief, or my argument, is that if we were to uncap the House and you were to increase the number of members in Congress and obviously their staff, I think there are two things that are true. I think one is that the nature of the representative would change, such that you're not electing people who are imminently kind of incentivized by the system to not pay attention to you, but are actually becoming more incentivized to pay a little bit more attention. And two, I think those staffers could or should replace, essentially on a one-to-one basis, current executive level bureaucrats, right? So you could imagine somebody who is in the executive branch who works for the Department of Energy, or for the FAA, or for the VA, or for any of these agencies, especially the agencies that have satellite offices in all 50 states, the USDA, and those staffers could basically transition, and I think that benefits the budget on in two ways. One is that you're just moving them over, and two, instead of having the civil service protection, they also now become terminable at will. Being in the House or in the Senate as a staffer, there's not nearly as many protections for those individuals, and so theoretically, you get a slightly more effective worker for the American people. But I will admit that that is the number one challenge I get is more politicians. No, right? And it's counterintuitive. It's like it's to shrink the federal executive branch. You have to grow the legislative branch. That's the way it works in my opinion.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and you make a very valid point. One of the fundamental responsibilities of Congress is oversight of the executive, and Congress can't possibly conduct oversight the way it should with the limited staff, that expert staff that are there, and the continual drag on members of Congress who are simply have to focus on too many issues at once when they're on 3 or 4 full committees and 5 or 6 subcommittees. They just can't do that. And going back to our other subject of conversation here, particularly when they're drawn constantly by the media and the need for campaigning, and they're distracted by so many other things, it can't possibly happen. And what has evolved from that over a period of years is overreach on the part of the executive. We're experiencing that with President Trump, but we experienced it with Biden and Obama and Bush to a certain degree. It's been going on a very long time. Franklin Roosevelt was the prince of overreach, but you just can't function. The Congress is never going to regain its trust of the American people unless it behaves in an independent fashion and exerts its authority and flexes its muscles so that we do have 3 balanced branches, which are independent but tied together, like triplets in how they conduct the government and how they meet the requirements of the founding fathers, who were a lot brighter than they are today. So that's one of the really crucial things that people don't see when they look at increasing the size of Congress. But oversight is incredibly important. And today, the hearings that are conducted and the investigations that never seem to go away really don't focus on the vital needs of the American public or the important political issues that we never seem to solve. You know, they've gone from problems to crises, and the government will never be large enough to deal with them. So we've got to find innovative new ways to get that done.
Yeah, when I was on oversight, I mean, what I found was we ended up preparing hearings and witnesses essentially to create, clips that you could then televise in order for the member to get reelected. Right. That in a lot of ways that is and was the goal. There are real investigations that take place. I'm not aware of any investigations that take place where there's not an explicit, staging of questions and witnesses to ensure you get, that televised moment that you can then use to go raise money, which, we will get into. I want to touch on the Massey race before we conclude the hour. But I wanted to, because you have been serving there so long, were you there when they started C-SPAN on the Hill?
When the what?
When they started C-SPAN, when they started televising everything.
Yeah.
What I hope, when I was on the Hill, I always heard rumors about how that changed everything. Is that your perception?
No.
No.
It changed things, but it really didn't change the way the conspiracy.
Mike, it looks like I'm getting an alert here saying your recording has stopped because of an incoming call.
It's a very positive contribution, I think, because it gave citizens direct access to floor proceedings. And that is absolutely critical in the education of the citizenry, because they've got to see how things really happen, not how the press and special interests present what has happened. Those of us, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, given your service, that oftentimes what actually happens in Congress has nothing to do with the perception that's created of what's being done in Congress. So I think C-SPAN was a benefit in that regard. Obviously, it created opportunities for the showboats, but really not to the extent that it really damaged the function of Congress. Okay. Watching a full debate is good for you.
Yeah. No, that's I'm glad to hear that, because I feel like you've got a good perspective on this, and having been there kind of before and after, and really seeing it, that's helpful, because it, one of the other objections we get to uncapping houses, it's like, well, where are you going to put them? And one of our board members is just like, well, why do they need to be in DC? Why can't they participate mostly remotely? Obviously, we have vast bureaucracies that operate, across the United States. They're not all in DC. The Veterans Affairs, not that they're a great example, obviously operates across the states. USDA operates across the states. FAA operates across the states. Why do they all need to be in DC? And I think there's some wisdom to that. They could participate in their home states, and they could caucus in their state, and they could go to DC less frequently, and they could vote electronically. I mean, certainly we know how our military intelligence services know how to communicate electronically securely. It seems like there's some opportunity for that. But one of the worries that I've had is, this, right? The C-SPAN argument. That basically, having everything documented and having everything televised really kind of put the kibosh on good debate. And I'm hearing you say maybe that's not such a worry. And so, maybe there is a little bit more opportunity for members to be, meeting everyone in person less frequently. Have you ever heard of Dunbar's number? This is kind of like the cube root rule. It's another one of these kind of obscure social science deals.
No, I don't think I have.
Okay, so Dunbar's number is so it's the idea that a person can know no more than 150 people well. And so, they've looked at, societies across time, and, in general, a person basically can't have more than 150 close friends. And they look at like the uncontacted tribes, and anytime one of these uncontacted tribes gets over like 150 people, there ends up being a split, a faction, because, I don't know, our brains just can't handle more than that. And so I've used this as an argument. It's like, the Senate is below Dunbar's number, right? There's 100 members. It's always been below 100 or at 100 members or below. And, it probably always will be. And that's fine. Even if they're elected by the states, it's fundamentally different in character than the House, in that the House is, our founders, I think, always saw it as being a bit more of an unwieldy factionist body. And so, I agree with you that, we should grow it slowly. Like, we probably should not, add 1,000 members overnight. That would be disruptive, especially on the rules pieces and all this. But, if we were to slowly add, say, 150 members every 10 years, it could continue to grow, right? We could continue to grow that body. And yes, it would become slightly more wieldy, but that's a feature, not a bug, right? That, it necessarily will have factions. And in some ways, those factions will allow more bipartisanship, right? Because you'll have people reaching across party lines in order to, get bills passed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder, because you mentioned kind of how the Senate had become more like the House because they're being elected. You spent time in the Senate, though, right?
Pardon?
Did you spend time in the Senate?
No, I did not. Well, I spent a lot of time there because I was in the Republican leadership, but
okay.
not as a Senate staffer, no.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, how much of the old as factionist or as contentious as the Senate seems today, it does still seem more cohesive than the House. And I just wonder how much of kind of the old, that sentimentality of the old boys club does still pervade in the Senate, or at least, when you were on the Hill last, do you still see some distinctions there in kind of the nature of the House versus the Senate, just by the sheer number of people?
Yeah, well, I think the old boy network is still functioning, but it's an old boy network. It's getting kind of crotchety, and it just doesn't have the vitality that it used to have, and that's primarily due to the harsh partisanship that has evolved. And maybe a little bit because more members of the House have moved to the Senate. I think there are now 25 or 30 members of the Senate who once served in the House. So they've, that it has changed in that sense. But the fundamentals of legislating are still there and need to be preserved, and that one of those fundamentals is the personal relationships that exist and are built in an old club like that, and similarly in the House, because the members have to trust each other, and your word has to be your bond in that kind of environment. or chaos results. And members go off on their own and become show horses rather than workhorses, which I'm sure you're intimately familiar with. And we need more workhorses in Congress than we need show horses. There are just too many there that came to Congress without any intent of being serious legislators. That has really gotten to be a critical problem. So there's something good about the Old Boy Network and the intimacy that is created in those kind of environments. I'm not sure that when you enlarge the house that you make it more remote and try to build a functioning system that allows members to stay back in their own states. My preference would be to move the bureaucracy out of Washington and keep the members here, like you mentioned with those various agencies. There's absolutely no reason why the United States Department of Agriculture should be headquartered, located in the District of Columbia. Washington should be in Wyoming or Montana or Kansas, or it should be in an agriculture area. The same holds true with the Commerce Department and the Education Department, which unfortunately we're not going to have for very much longer. But the inculcation of decision making in the bureaucracy in Washington is not what the founders intended, and it is certainly not beneficial in maintaining our relationships with the citizenry, with the people. My gosh, there are enough people in Missouri and Kansas to populate a Department of Agriculture located in St. Louis. There's really no excuse for that other than the concentration of power that takes place in a political environment in Washington. So I feel very strongly about the need for more trust and personal relationship among members of Congress, and also how best to build the trust of the American people back in the system so it can be reformed in a positive way. We've tried to reform campaign spending for years and years and never succeeded because the motivation really wasn't right. And if you don't have the right motivation in both your relationships and the policy making that you are engaged in, then you're going to fail.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with everything that you just said, and I think ultimately how this shakes out depends on when we uncap the House. How much does it happen by overtime, and because one could imagine. I've had conversations with staffers, on kind of the topic of a larger uncap, right? If you did get up to a couple thousand members and staff, and then add staff onto that, and one of them turned to me. He was like, "Do you think we could embed a staffer at each agency that we oversee or we have jurisdiction over? Right? Could we have a congressional staffer that actually knows where the filing cabinet is, what the files are that we want?" It's like, that there's something to that. I mean, and it's also, it's not just about knowing where the filing cabinet is, but it's about having congressional staffers that do actually have that personal relationship with the executive bureaucrat, right? And maybe that's in their respective home jurisdiction. It could also be in DC. Maybe it's some amalgamation. But I think you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, good governance in some ways does come down to how do we have these human relationships in a way that is structured to divide power, right? Keeping those three branches totally separate. But on the topic of money and big spending, today is Monday, May 18th. Tomorrow is May 19th. It's the primary in Kentucky. Thomas Massie is being primaried, and the executive branch is coming after Thomas Massie very hard. He voted against Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. He invoked a rule to force a vote on the Epstein Transparency Act, and I think Pete Hegseth, the sitting Secretary of Defense / War, is campaigning against Massie on behalf of theoretically not in violation of the Hatch Act, but out there campaigning. I think the spend is up to like $36 million, which I'm pretty sure is the most money that's ever been spent in a single congressional primary. I don't know. What are your reflections? I mean, you've been doing this a long time. What do you see?
Well, I'm not a great fan of Massie's, but I
bit of a showboat.
Huh?
Bit of a showboat.
Yeah, well, he is, but he's also he also seems to me to be driven by his ideological foundations, and his roots in that sense. But first of all, what's going on there really points to the evil that occurs when there is so much money poured into a congressional district or a legislative district. Or you can't, come on. This is not representative government when people that can only write a $25 check are going to prevail, or in a situation where there's so much money poured into advertising that is at best misrepresents reality and what's going on, and at worst completely distorts the system so that voters are subject to propaganda and to kinds of persuasion that we saw in fascist and Nazism and communism. It's obscene, and so that's what is challenging Massie, and also challenged Cassidy in Louisiana. It just really corrupts the system. Pete Hegseth has no business engaged in a campaign in a congressional primary, and neither does any of the other cabinet members or troops that Trump and other presidents have sent in. Leave the people alone. Let them decide. Even if you assume in their ignorance, it is still their right to decide. And we have really hurt the process in not letting them decide.
Yeah, I think it perpetuates or enforces learned helplessness, right? If a person, in Kentucky is just like, well, heck, I can't tell what the truth is, essentially, they just give up, right? So, this problem of civic education you're talking about, I think this is exactly the type of behavior that, reinforces kind of, I'm just going to go get a 12-pack and drink away the weekend, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what they're doing. God bless them. This also brings up the subject of gerrymandering, which is one of the key problems that we discuss in detail, along with expanding the size of the House and other things that can be done. Gerrymandering is what gives the outsiders the opportunity to come in and challenge Massie, because he is in a gerrymandered kind of district where decisions are made in primaries and not in the general election. We have, when you've got only 19 or 20% of the congressional districts that are really competitive in this country because of gerrymandering, then you've corrupted the system badly. I've been a big fan of some of the other kinds of solutions, such as the independent commissions and different kind of voting representation that have been out there. And I think if we give them time, they can do a great deal to eliminate that problem. It is pretty bad when both parties get involved in a gerrymandering war that is in violation of the Constitution, that is anathema to what was intended by the founding fathers, and really creates an electoral process that is totally focused on partisan political gain and not electing competent members to Congress who will come together in the middle and set aside their partisan belief long enough to get legislation passed.
Absolutely. And I think, the long-term effect of this, from my perspective, my pitch to the powers that be is you're winding up with a more ignorant America, which is going to lose to China in the end. So what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up for failure on the international stage. And, in order to win internationally, we have to set ourselves up with good incentives internally. And otherwise, I think we're set to give up our position of power on the global stage. And time will tell. Mike, it was so good to have you. Thank you for being here. Mike's book, go check it out. Fixing Congress, Restoring Power to the People. Mike, where would you like people to go buy that? Is there, do you want them to go to Amazon, or is there somewhere else?
Easiest place is Amazon, and it's down to a reduced price. It's a paperback, so it's affordable. So I hope people will do that. I know it's not a very sexy subject, but it's a very critical one for the strength of our democracy. And thanks for the pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, go check out that book. And also, I'm going to be following up about the Congressional Institute with you, Mike. And I suggest others to follow, see what they're doing. This is exactly the type of work that needs to be happening. And hopefully we can all work together to find our way out of this mess and towards a republic where power is divided and not concentrated, and we flourish as a nation. So until next time, folks, thank you so much. I will see you next Monday. And Mike, thank you again. If you can just stay on after I stop the live recording here.
Sure, absolutely.